Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf tzadibet. Today's daf is dedicated in memory of the 15 people killed in the tragic shooting in Sydney, Australia yesterday, including two Chabad shlichim, Rabbi Eli Schlenger and Rabbi Yaakov Levitan, and for refuah shlema ukrova to all the injured. This week's learning is sponsored by Caroline Bolag, Lilo Nishma Pinchas Ben Menashe Peiser. Today's daf is sponsored by Natalie Taylor in honor of Dr. Jordana Hyman on her 50th birthday. Mazal Tov. We all love you and admire everything you give to the world. May we celebrate many birthdays together. Love your fresh and frolic friends. Today's daf is sponsored by Arthur Gould in loving memory of Carol's father, Louis Robinson, Yehuda Leib and Moshe Zichrono Levrcha. Today, the first day of Chanuka, we mark his 26th year at site. Louis was a devoted family man, an active participant in a synagogue, and could fix anything. When one of his girls was on a date, he never went to bed until she was safely home. Lua, Irma, and Carol are together in the next world. Okay, we'll get started. Just a reminder, it's toward the end of the year, so Circle of Friends, our donations are very welcome right now. So thank you to all those who've already given. If you haven't taken care of it yet, you still have time. And new course in Hebrew that's starting for the beginner's guide to Gemara in Hebrew. If you haven't done the ones in English, there are 3 parts in English. We're on the second part in Hebrew. So you can always go back. They're digital courses. They live on our site. In fact, on the new site, it's even easier to find. Right at the bottom of the page, you can see all our courses. There's skills courses also. There's all different kind of courses. So if you haven't seen them yet, you can look and benefit from those courses that are digital and available wherever you are. Okay, with that, we'll get started. One last reminder for those who come on the Zoom. So the Zoom will not be meeting until next Tuesday. Tuesday, we'll start back again. And all the shiurim are already up on the site. So you can view them at your whenever you want, but they'll also go up as normal. The links will be sent out as usual. And thank you to those who are sending out the links. Okay. Let's get started. So at the end of Tzadi Aleph Amud Bet, we always kind of rush at the end of class. So I will sort of just go back for a quick minute and review the end of class. Shmuel had said, after talking about can you bring an oil offering to the temple, remember there's oil and wine libations that go with nisachim. That's mentioned in Bamidbar. Okay, there's a whole list of the wine and oil libations that we bring with the sacrifices. Those are done, okay, and those are definites. The whole question is, never says in the Torah, like it says, if you want to bring a sacrifice, you can bring an ola or a shlamim voluntary. If you want to bring a mincha, you can bring a mincha offering voluntary. And there's a whole description, which we'll learn in Menachot, of all the different kinds you could bring. But it never says anything about wine or oil. So now Shmuel so we saw in the Mishnah that Rabbi Tarfon holds that you could bring oil. And then we saw in the Gemara that Rabbi Akiva holds you could bring wine. And then Shmuel comments on, well, how do you bring them? So when it came to the oil, he said, you do it just like the mincha. You take a bit, right, the handful, and you burn the rest on the altar. You don't burn the whole thing, but then we saw there was an alternate opinion that you burn the whole thing. When it comes to the wine is generally poured into those cups at the top of the altar. That's how you do the wine for the libations. But Shmuel said when it comes to a voluntary wine offering, it also goes on the fire. So the pasuk he brought, and I wanted to just explain how he gets from this pasuk and what this pasuk is. We didn't really have time yesterday, but the pasuk that he quotes is Yayin takriv l'nesech chatziahi yishereach nichach l'Hashem. It's a strange pasuk to prove because the pasuk that's talking about the wine for the libation. So how are you proving the voluntary wine offerings from the libation? Now remember, there is no pasuk about the regular ones. And what's strange about this pasuk, even more, not just that he brings this, but and this is why he darshans it. It says the wine libations, which we know are poured into those cups. Okay, what they would do, by the way, is they would stop up the cup. They would put like a cork in the hole because it was a cup that sat on top of these holes in the altar. And remember, it's supposed to be eaten by the altar, consumed by the altar, kind of like a person drinks a cup. So what they would do is they would fill up the cup and then take out the cork, and then all the wine would go down at once. So there was like the mizbeach was kind of drinking the wine. That was the idea. But when it comes to the wine, it says, Yain takriv l'nesech chatziahin, isherech nichach l'Hashem. It says it's burned. Now, the wine doesn't get burned. The wine goes into the altar. So that's why he says, it must be that this is a reference to the fact that there's a voluntary wine, and the voluntary wine offering gets burned, thrown on the fire. Now, The problem is it puts out the fire. That's where we ended with this idea of it extinguishes the fire, and how can you do that? So we said maybe it's only partial extinguishing is not a problem. We said, what about this other source? We had a few questions, but then we ended with a really pretty basic question, which is this braita that goes against Shmuel, and Shmuel can't disagree with the braita that says, well, unless he can say I hold by a different opinion, which is what we're going to say in the end. But the braita says that according to Rabbi Akiva, it goes into the cups, the wine, the voluntary wine offering. So how do you deal with that? To which we said there's two approaches. There's the braita's approach, and the Shmuel follows a different approach, and it all is based on this famous machloket, davar she'eino mitkaven. If I'm trying to do one action, which is pour the wine on the altar, in the process I'm doing a different action which I didn't really intend and I don't really want, which is to pour, to put out the fire. Remember this pasuk that says you cannot put out the fire on the altar. So, but I'm not trying to do that. So Rabbi Shimon says, if you're not trying to do it, it's patur, you're exempt. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you're obligated, because in the end, you're doing it. Who cares what your intention was? It doesn't matter what your intention is. So that's how we explain the difference between the braita and Shmuel. But the Gemara is now going to question, wait a minute, how could you say that Shmuel holds like Rabbi Shimon? Because look, okay, end of Sadi Aleph on the bed, 2 lines from the bottom. L'meimer de Shmuel ka Rabbi Shimon svirale? You really think he holds like Rabbi Shimon? V'hamar Shmuel, doesn't he say, Michabing, okay, let's say there's a burning coal in the middle of the street on Shabbos. Are you allowed to put it out or not? So it depends what it's made out of. Gacheret shel matechet, if it's a burning coal, something's burning of metal, b'rshut harabim, you can put it out, b'shvil shelo yizoku barabim, so that nobody gets injured. It's a hazard. So you're allowed to pour out the fire if it's from metal, burning metal. If it's a coal that's made of wood, what's the problem? The problem is that when you put out a coal made of wood, you've actually created charcoal. And we don't want, that's a positive action. If you remember in Masechet Shabbat, we learned, it has to be a creative action. Why is kiboy forbidden? Extinguishing. Because when you extinguish, you're making something. Okay, you're actually preparing, if it's a wick, you extinguish it to prepare it for use. If it's right, I don't know, last night I was struggling to light my Chanuka candle, right, with the oil. It doesn't light so well. If you already light it beforehand, then you prepare the wick, then it lights very easily. If it's a coal, you want the coal for, you sometimes put it out in order to use the coal. So you've created something. And that's the real melacha on Shabbat of extinguishing. It's not because you can't put out a fire. You can't put out a fire because of the positive action that's being created, that the coal is turning into a coal. So, when it's a kachelet shel eitz where it turns into a coal, and you've done this positive thing, you can't do it, even if it's a hazard to the public. But it's only derabanan, it's only forbidden by rabbinic law to put out a fire if it's a metal kind of coal that's burning. You're allowed to put it out because there is no coal that's created from that. So, now, if he holds like Rabbi Shimon, now we're going to see. It sounds like they're thinking this is the exact same machloket, but it's clearly not the same machloket. What is this issue? This is what we call, and I'll get to it, we'll see it inside in a minute, melacha she'ena tzricha legufa. It's, what are you trying to extinguish here? Yes, you are trying to extinguish. It's not like the wine, that you're not trying to extinguish, you're just trying to pour wine on the altar. Here you're actually trying to extinguish. But why are you trying to extinguish? To protect people. You're not trying to extinguish to create a positive action of this charcoal that's going to be created. So that's the difference here. That's a melacha she'ena tzricha legufa. Now there's also a debate between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. Just like Rabbi Shimon is lenient about davar she'ena mitkaven, he's lenient about melacha she'ena tzricha legufa. And the Gemara, in suggesting this, I don't think the Gemara thinks that it's a davar she'ena mitkaven. The Gemara just thinks, how could Shmuel hold like Rabbi Shimon here, if he holds, and he forbids in this case, because he holds like Rabbi Yehuda on the melacha she'ena tzricha legufa case, and we're assuming those go hand in hand. To which the obvious answer is, right? So again, Isa, let's read it inside. Isa kadatak Rabbi Shimon sfira le'afilu gachelet shel eitz nami. Right? If he holds like Rabbi Shimon would say melacha she'ena tzricha legufa is patur. So again, you can do this. It's fine. If it's a hazard for the people, right? You shouldn't do it. Patur means you're exempt. It doesn't mean you should do it. But in this case, yes, you should do it because it's a hazard to the public. And that's not what Shmuel says. So the answer, b'davar she'ena mitkaven, savar like Rabbi Shimon, melacha she'ena tzricha legufa, savar like Rabbi Yehuda. These are two different debates. We could side with Rabbi Shimon on one of them and side with Rabbi Yehuda on the other, and therefore this is no contradiction at all. moving now to, by the way, one of the classic examples is moving a dead body out of the house because you don't want the smell in the house, let's say. So you're moving it outside. Normally, why do I do hotza'ah? I take things out because I want them outside, right? I move one thing from one domain to the other because I need it there. That's a different story, right? I want to take my siddur to shul, right? So that would be forbidden because that's a positive action. But if I just don't want it where it is, that's a different story. That's a melacha she'en tzricha legufa, right? So that would be an example of a case. Okay. Amar Rav Huna. Now we're on a totally different topic. We were talking about libations, so now they're going to mention something about libations. And the parak's going to end in a bit of a strange place. Nisachim shenitmeu. If I have libations that are in the temple and they became impure, what do I do with them? So they're in the azara, they become impure. Well, you make a fire on the floor of the azara and burn them. In other words, you have to make their own fire. You can't put them on the altar because they're disqualified, but you burn them in the azara. They can't leave the azara, basically. So even though they're disqualified, you have to burn them here in the azara. How do we get this? Okay, there's a bit of a creative reading of the pasuk. It says, right? Remember this is the blood of the sin offering. We're in chapter 6, verse 23. I'm telling you this particularly because we're going to read all these psukim in another minute. The next chapter is going to deal with this whole section of psukim. If you have a sin offering, that the blood is brought inside the inner sanctuary, it's disqualified. And lo te'achel, it shouldn't be eaten, ba'esh yisaref, it should be burned. But what they do is, since it says, if you bring the blood into Ol Moed L'chaper B'Kodesh to atone inside in the sanctuary, burn it ba'esh, what they do is they say, the word Kodesh is not far from, it's not exactly next to, but it's close to, right? The last word in the first phrase is B'Kodesh. Then it says, don't eat, burn it. They say, it must be you burn it in the Kodesh. Okay, they connect between the first part and the last part, and the last word in the last part, and say, we can take that word and use it both in the beginning part of the pasuk and for the second phrase. In the Kodesh, burn it. Tanya nami hachi, braita to support this. Hadam v'ashemim v'amenachov v'nesachim shenitmu. If you have blood or oil or mincha offering or libations that became impure, oselem aracha b'fnei atzman v'sorfan. You make their own fire on the floor of the azara and you burn it. Amar le Shmuel or Rav Chana Bagdata. This is where I think it ends in a bit of a strange place. Shmuel says to Rav Chana Bagdata, bring me 10 people, and I'm going to say this in front of you with 10 people watching, and I'm going to teach them this halacha, okay? I'm going to teach it to you in front of 10 people. That's anytime somebody wants to really publicize things, they say, do it in front of 10 people. And with that, hadran alach kol atadir. With that, we finish our chapter. It's very strange. Why is that so strange? And I'm going to just leave you with a question. I didn't have time to research it, but it says here that basically if you have these libations that became impure, you have to burn them on the floor of the azara. And this was so important for Shmuel to teach. It's super irrelevant halacha to people right now, right? In Shmuel's time, there was no temple. You would think that when you gather 10 people, it's something very relevant that you want everybody to know about. So here, why it was so important. Number one, there's no temple. Number two, it's a bit of not a very central halacha of all the temple issues that we've been discussing. So I'm going to leave you with a question as to why this was so important for him to do that and why it was so important for the Gemara to tell us that he wanted to gather 10 people to tell them this halacha. Okay, with that, we're going to move on to our next section. Okay, to start this section, it's about blood that gets onto a garment and it needs washing. Now, the case is that we have blood from a sacrifice after it was already put in the sanctified vessel, before it was sprinkled. So there's a very small time when this happens. It has to be blood that was already sanctified and then gets splashed onto your clothing. The clothing has to be washed in the azara. Okay, we mentioned this before. Now we're really going to learn it. And not just this, we're going to learn this chapter, a bunch of psukim that come up about the sin offering specifically. Okay, just note, this is halacha specifically for the sin offering. We're going to read now the section about Zot Torah Chatat. Okay, in pasuk chapter 6 of Vayikra, verse starts 17, we'll start with 18. Tell Aaron and his sons, Zot Torah Chatat. Today we're going to darshan this pasuk. These are the rules for the sin offering. Okay, that we learned. The place where to do the shechita in the same place as the ola, which is tzafon. We did that a while ago in Ezem Mukoman Shel Zevachim. Lifnei Hashem, before God, Kodesh Kodashim He. Okay, it's Kodesh Kodashim. Okay, the Kohen who does the service, right, who does the sprinkling of the blood, he will eat it in a sanctified place. B'chatzar ol moed, in the courtyard of the ol moed. Kol, meaning it has to be eaten in the Yazara only. Kol asher yiga b'vsara yikdash. This halacha we'll learn later on, which is anything that touches, if the meat of a chata touches other meat and the flavors are absorbed, that meat gets the same rules as the chata. It has the same status as if it's chata meat. Vasher yazemi dama, here's our pasuk. Okay, this is pasuk, middle of pasuk kaf, 20. Asher yazemi dama ala beged, if blood is sprinkled onto a garment, asher yazeh aleha, which is sprinkled on it. You'll see that's kind of repetitive. We'll deal with that another time. Tichabes b'makom kadosh. You have to launder it in a sanctified place. Then it gets into klicheres, that you cook in, has to be broken in an earthenware vessel. If you cook sanctified meat in a metal implement, you have to do what's called shtifa and mirika, kind of cleansing. Okay, that's all about cooking meat, the meat that you're cooking that you get to eat from the sin offering. So you have to do all these halachot. Later we'll learn that these apply also, by the way, to other sacrifices, not just the sin offering, even though this is the sin offering. Okay, and then the last pasuk in the section is, right, then it says all the male kohanim get to eat this. And then it says, Kol chatat asher yuvami damal o moed, the pasuk we just read, that's the end of the section. If you bring the blood into the heichal, into the inner sanctuary, it's disqualified. Okay, so now we're going to learn about the kibus, the laundering. Dam chatat shenitaz ala beged. I'm now in the Mishnah. The blood of a sin offering, specifically only a sin offering, shenitaz ala beged, that sprinkles on your garment or any garment, hareze ta'un kibus, it needs laundering. Now, there's two types of sin offerings. There's really three we're going to talk about today. There's the sin offering of an animal and sin offering of a bird. Okay. Then there's also sin offering that's brought in on the inner altar and the outer altar. Remember, the outer altar is the classic chatat, which is brought if you accidentally, unwittingly did a sin that is liable. You're liable for karet. The ones on the inner, we spent a lot of time on that in Horayot, and we made mention of it a lot of other times, the Parlim Gavashal Tzibor, the Par Kohen Gadol B'Yom Kippurim, right, the Seir, all those sin offerings that are brought inside. What's the main difference? They're not eaten. That's what this is talking about. This is talking about sin offerings that are eaten. Okay, the obvious is that the sin, how do we know it's talking about sin offerings that are eaten? Because a lot of the psukim we talked about, we're all talking about the eating of the meat, right? Shne'emal, here we go, B'makom kadosh te'achel. Okay, that's pasuk Yud Tet. There it said, "Hakohen mechateu tayochlena." The kohen who does the sprinkling of the blood will eat it. So it's obvious it's talking about the inner, the outer ones, the ones that are eaten, the ones brought on the outer altar. But the Mishnah then says, even though the pasuk is talking specifically, so we started, I kind of glossed over it, but af al pi she'ena katuv medaber ela b'nei chalot. Even though the pasuk is clearly only talking about the ones you eat. Which ones need kibus? The ones brought on the inner altar, also. Besides the ones brought on the outer altar, also the ones brought on the inner altar. Shenemal, how do we know this? Because it says Torah chatat. These are the rules for the chatat. Whenever it says Torah, they like to say this drasha. Torah achad l'chol chatat. There's one rule for all sin offerings, meaning all sin offerings are the same. Even though we're going to see not really, because there's three types of sin offerings. There's inner altar, outer altar, and bird. We're going to see that this doesn't apply to birds. Okay? Not yet, but we'll get there in the Gemara. Chatat psula. Okay, here's an exception to the rule where you don't need kibus. Chatat psula ein damatun kibus. If you have a disqualified sin offering, let's say you did it shelo lishma. Okay, you disqualified it. So now the blood's not supposed to be sprinkled. So because it's disqualified, the blood gets on your garment. You don't have to do kibus. Doesn't matter what kind of disqualified. We're going to end our daf with seeing somebody disagrees with this point. But the Mishnah says, bein shaita lashata kosher, whether it was valid and then got disqualified, or bein shelo shaita lashata kosher, or whether it was never valid to begin with. Now, what does it mean to begin with? Well, once the slaughtering happened. Okay? In other words, obviously before the slaughtering it could have been valid, but if it's what it means, well, we're going to see in a minute. They're going to give examples. I'll show you. So, eze hishe haita lashata kosher, what does that mean? Shelana v'shenitma v'shiyatzat. In other words, you slaughtered it, you collected it in the clay, in the kli sharet, in the vessel, and then you didn't deal with it, you didn't sprinkle the blood, you left it overnight, disqualified, or it got impure, or it left. So it was able to be sprinkled once you did the slaughtering, and once it went into the vessel, it could have been slaughtered, because that's when it becomes relevant, right? Once it goes in that vessel. Before that, you can't sprinkle the blood. So if it was valid for a moment even, after it was in the kli, then it's disqualified, that's a case of haitala shata kosher. Still it gets on your clothing at this point if it's disqualified. It's not relevant. You don't have to do kibus. What's the case where it was never valid? Already in the slaughtering you ruined it. You had a pigol machshava. You thought, oh, I'm going to sprinkle the blood in the wrong time, or I'm going to eat the meat in the wrong time or in the wrong place. Or if disqualified people accepted the blood, because then the blood was never really properly accepted in the klei sharet. Let's say it was a kohen who was impure. Okay? So those are lo eshala shata kosher. In any case, according to our Mishnah, it doesn't matter. Both these categories, if it's disqualified for any of those reasons, it gets on your clothing after the disqualification, you don't need laundry. Okay, so now we're going to go back to the first halacha, or the first main point, that it also applies to the chatot pnimiyot. And the first part of our daf, we're going to have two parts right now. One is going to be to figure out why chatat of is out and the chatot pnimiyot are in. Okay, why? No pun intended. The inner ones are counted in for laundering, and the bird offerings are not. Okay, that's going to be our first part of our daf. The second part is going to be 3 questions, 2 about bird sin offerings and 1 about blood on clothing. And the 2 about the bird don't really have so much to do with kibus because there is no law of kibus for the bird offerings. But you'll see that the second question is going to relate, it's going to bring an answer or an attempt to answer from this braita we're about to read, and that's why it gets into this sugya. Okay, into our daf. So dam chatat shenitaz. Okay, that's just a quote from the Mishnah, and now they're going to say, if the rules are true for all sin offerings, well then, afilu chatat ofnami, then the bird sin offering should be included in the laws of kibus. And now, how do we know they're not? Well, we're going to prove it now. We're going to see from a braita that they're not. Alama Tanya. Well, then why does it say in a braita, Yachol yehei dam chatat ofton kibus? You might have thought that the blood of a bird sin offering would require kibus, laundering. Talmud Lomar Zot. This is a classic. We have Zot, which has only this one. And then we have Torah, which is it's the same for all of them. So we're going to include and exclude, and that's the way we're going to go. And the majority of our daf is going to be figuring out why we're including that one and excluding that one. They love to ask that question, right? Very nice. You have an inclusion pasuk and an exclusion, or a word that includes, a word that excludes. But why'd you go that direction, not the opposite direction? So for that, we'll have 3 answers. So right now we're just in the drasha. Zot Torah chatat. Torah comes to say it's the same for all, so it includes. Zot comes to say only this one, so we're going to exclude the birds. So Amar Rish Lakish Mishum Bar Kapara. So now we're back to our question. If Torah chad l'chol chataot, then also chatat of should be included. And then why did it say it's not? So Amar Rish Lakish Mishum Bar Kapara. Why is it not? Because Amar Krat Tishachet. It says, okay, this is the pasuk. Let's read it. Zot Torah chatat. Remember this. B'mkom asher tishachet ha'olah, the place where the olah is slaughtered, that's where the chatat is slaughtered. So obviously we're talking only about things that are slaughtered. Remember, birds don't get slaughtered; they have malika. So because it says tishachet, b'nishchatot hakatuv medaber, they're obviously talking about ones that are slaughtered. You have to remember this is going to be something that you have to pay close attention to because our whole chapter is going to be dealing with these mitzvot, marika and shtifa, breaking the vessels of the earthenware vessels and all these halachot, and it's always going to go back to, we view these psukim as a unit. So if in one pasuk it's talking about chatat, it must be all the psukim are talking about chatat. And if one's this, but then we're going to have all sorts of exceptions to the rule. We're going to say, oh no, shtifa, marika, all korbanot. And so it's kind of confusing because on the one hand they view this as a unit, and whatever's true, right, it's going to be learned from other psukim in the section. On the other hand, sometimes they're going to say, oh yeah, but other things are included as well. So anyway, he says, okay, it says tishachet. We must be talking about animals. Ve'ema, well wait. Okay, yes, it says tishachet, but what else does it say? It says ema b'nei chalot hakatuv b'daber. But maybe it's only talking about ones that are eaten, because it also there's a lot of talk in this psukim about who eats it, where they eat it. Okay, it said the Zevachim kohanim eat it at the end. It said earlier, the kohen who does the blood, he's the one who gets to eat it. And they quote one of the psukim, right? The kohen who gets to eat it eats in a sanctified place. Now, what happens to the inner sin offerings? Remember the Par Kohen and Mashiach and all those? Blood gets sprinkled, number one, first sprinkled on the parochet, Then it gets placed on the four corners of the inner altar. That's all happening in the sanctuary. And then you take the animal far, far out, all the way out, out of Jerusalem even, and you burn it in this place called the Beit HaDeshen. And you don't eat it. None of it gets eaten. So if it's talking about eating, it obviously is excluding the Chataot HaPnimiyot, which goes against what our Mishnah said, right? It goes against what we want to get to. So they say, no, Rabbi Rahmana Torah. So he says, oh, that's the whole thing. Torah comes to include something that wasn't included in the pasuk yet, which is that. Ihachi, so we're back to, well then, Chatata Ofnami. So then if it's including, let it include the bird. We're kind of going around in circles a little bit. Mi'at Rahmana Zot. Well, no, Zot comes to exclude the bird. Okay, so this is all to answer the question. If it's Torah Achat, why don't we have the bird? And how do we know we don't have the bird? Because we have that braita that says Zot comes to exclude the bird. And the answer is because we have Torah, which comes to include something. We have that which comes to exclude something. So we end up including that, excluding that. Okay, it still didn't. Okay, that's basically the answer as to why the Chatat Of is not in the Mishnah. But it doesn't really answer any question because Umara Ita. Okay, but why exclude this one and not that one? For this, we're going to have three answers. First answer, Mistaber the Chatat Behema Havalei Ribui. Okay, it's just more logical that if we're going to include one, it's going to be the Chatat of the animal, meaning the inner altar, the one brought on the inner altar. Shekem, because there's a lot more similarities between the bird sin offering, between the inner sin offering to the outer sin offering. Okay, the outer is the main one, and it's much more similar to the inner one than it is to the bird offering. And let's see. So why? Shekem behema. First of all, they're both animals. Number two, shchitat safon. They both require slaughtering in the north, part of the azara. Kabbalat kli. The blood goes in a vessel. Okay, let's remember what happens with the blood of the bird. The kohen takes the bird, if you remember the sin offering, and he holds the bird in his hand. The blood. Okay, after doing malika, he just sprinkles from the bird's body itself. It never goes into a vessel. We're going to talk about this later today. Never goes into a vessel. It just gets sprinkled straight onto the altar. Bikeren, corner, the horns of the mizbeach. Okay, that's a law for both. The inner goes on the four horns of the inner altar, and the outer one goes on the four horns of the outer. Etzba, how does the kohen put it on? Puts his finger in and puts it on all four corners. Now the bird offering, we just said, sprinkles straight from there, not with his finger. He's holding the bird in his hand. Vichuda, and it's done on the corner where the two sides meet. This, by the way, the last time we saw these similarities, we talked about the Keren and Chuda are two mutually exclusive opinions. One says it has to go on the horns, and one says it has to go right in the corner. But either, if you hold that one, then that's similar, and they're similar in that way, or if you hold the other opinion, they're similar in the other way. V'ishim, and part of it gets burnt, or part or all of it gets burned on the fire. The parim, okay, they're even called, the inner ones are called the parim and israfim, right? Because they're burned completely. And in the chatat of the animal on the outer altar, the imurim get burned, remember? And then the meat goes to the kohen. But the bird offering, and if you remember, the bird sin offering, all the meat goes to the kohen. None of it is burned on the altar. So there it has so many more similarities. If we're going to include one, it's going to be the pnimi, and we're going to exclude the bird. Adrabah, chatarot havalei l'ribui. What do you mean? There's a lot of similarities between the outer sin offering and the bird sin offering, as opposed to the inner one. What are those? Sheken, kimota, chutz kimota. They're both done on the outer altar, the most obvious similarity. Achila kimota, and they're both eaten. There's parts of it that get eaten by the kohen, or the whole thing is eaten by the kohen, but there's eating associated with it. And that even was mentioned in the pasuk, so all the more so. To which the Gemara answers, the classic answer when they have this kind of a list, hanaf nefishim. There's more ways that it's similar, right? If you do a quantity of ways that it's similar or more than to the inner than it is to the bird. That's answer one. Answer two. Rav Yosef Amar, Amakrat Yochlena, Lizo v'lo la'achevet. Okay, the word Yochlena, it says in the pasuk again, what does it say? HaKohen mechateh ota Yochlena. Again, this isn't the pasuk about the kibus, just to be clear, but it's a pasuk just before it. So we're assuming these are all one unit. If that one's talking about that, then we're going to assume also the next one. What does that mean, Yochlena? He will eat it, okay? Or they will eat it. Now, eat it sounds like there's one that gets eaten that we're talking about here, and it's excluding a different one that gets eaten. Okay, you could possibly read it like that. So now, if it's going to exclude lizo v'lo la'achevet, okay? So this one, but not a different one that gets eaten. So what do you see there? The exclusion is excluding specifically something that's eaten. That would be the bird sin offering, and it wouldn't be the inner one. Inner one can't be excluded because it isn't even eaten. If we're excluding particularly one that's eaten, so they say, it's specifically limiting one of them ones that are eaten. It's saying this one that's eaten, yes, but not another one. So then they say, well then, elazot lamali. This is all trying to explain the drasha before that we had. What was the drasha with the exclusionary word zot? This and not something else. Now we're using yochlena instead of this, but we were all trying to just explain that drasha. So they say no, because ilav zot is a very interesting answer. If you didn't have zot, what would you have thought? Havamina yochlena orche dekra. Yochlena is just a regular way of writing. But kamash malan. Once you have zot, you know that there's an exclusion, and now we're looking for hints in the psukim. Which one is excluded? Because it says yochlena, which could be read as an exclusionary term, not necessarily, and that's why we wouldn't have known to read it as an exclusionary term unless you had the word zot. The word zot sets up something's excluded. Which one? We're going to learn that from yochlena. Because again, yochlena means you eat it, this one, not a different one that you eat. So that's to exclude the bird which gets eaten. Okay. Third answer, Rabba Amar. Amar Kra. Okay, Rabba is the most interesting, I think, because he flips the whole way we've been understanding this sugya. Until now, what do we think? The psukim that says zotar chatat, what are we talking about? The chatat on the outer altar, right? And then we're going to derive from that also the one brought on the inner altar and not the bird. Rabba is going to have a completely different explanation. He's going to say, and that was all, why do we assume that? Because it all kept talking about eating them, and that wouldn't be relating to the chatat apnimi. And also just because when it says chatat generally, the main sin offering is the one brought on the outer altar. Those are all exceptions to the rule, the inner ones. Rabba is going to completely flip this. He says, look at the pasuk about kibbutz. Okay, where I kept saying before that we look at this as a whole, but sometimes we're going to look at it very particularly, just this pasuk. The pasuk about laundering says, Asher yizeh, that is sprinkled from the blood onto your garment. Now, why did it use the language sprinkled? It could have used a different language, nishpach, something. It could have used some other language. Why does it say yazeh? Bihazaot, or some people say binizaot hakatuv medaber. It's telling you that what types of things are we talking about here? Things that where the blood is sprinkled. Which types of sacrifices is the blood sprinkled? Well, for one, the chatat pnimi. What did we say? The chatat chitzoni, the one on the outer altar, you do the placing of the blood on the altar. That's it. Placings, not sprinklings. The inner one, what do? Well, you sprinkle it first on the parochet, right, which is separating between the hechal and the inner, the kodesh kodeshim. And then you do the placements, but there's sprinkling in it. So he says this pasuk differs from the others where it's talking about eating and is specifically talking about the chatat pnimi. And then it's going to be a little easier because we're going to get from the chatat pnimi what's most similar to the pnimi, the chitzoni. And from there we're going to exclude the bird. Okay, so he flips everything on its head. Now, the Gemara is going to have a bunch of questions with this. Tana, doesn't it say in the Tanaitic source, right? Even though the pasuk is only talking about eating, okay, this is actually right. This is the first line in the Mishnah, right? The Dam Chatara Vezatun Kibbutz, it's the second line. Even though it's only talking about eating ones, it also includes the inner ones. So how do you relate to that pasuk? So they say something that's very hard to get because it's really about our Mishnah about kibbutz. Le'inya merika ushtifa. That pasuk is talking, that phrase, that the pasuk is really only talking about the nechalot, is really a reference to the other mitzvot in that section. Even though the other mitzvot in the section refer to ones that are eaten. Now why? Well, it's obvious why you can say that. Because what's merika and shtifa? You have to clean the pots that the meat was cooked in. Well, obviously you're only cooking meat if you can eat it. So therefore, the nechalot, that all relates to specifically other mitzvot in that section, not to kibbutz. Kibbutz is unique in that it's really avalein kibbutz asher yizektiv, which really refers to the chatat pnimi, which is sprinkled. Now remember, we're talking about when it sprinkles onto your clothes. We're not talking about the actual sprinkling, but the fact that they use that language means that we're talking about, it's a reference to the inner ones. So then they say, okay, but let's go to the next words of the Mishnah. It says, so those that are eaten and those that are brought on the inner altar. It should be, it should be the other order. It should start with the main one, which is the pnimi, and move to the chitzoni. So they say, okay, change the nusach and flip the order. Another question. What did I say? How do you sprinkle the blood of the chatat of? You sprinkle it. So if it's all about sprinkling, what would you say? What's in and what's out? The chatara pnimi needs kibus, and the chatara of, and specifically take out the outer sin offering, which is placed and not sprinkled. But mi'et rachmana zot. Now we're going to go back to our whole thing. Oh no, because it says zot, that excludes the bird. Well, then maybe it should exclude also the outer one. Riba rachmana Torah. No, okay, now we're doing this whole drasha from the reverse, right? From the case starting from the inner, then saying, okay, zot excludes the bird, but yet Torah includes the outer. To which they're going to again ask the question, Umara Ita, why that one and not that one? Mistabra chatat bema havalei ribuye sheken bema shchitat safon kabbalat kli keren be'etzba v'chuda v'ishim. Again, we go through that same list, which I'm not going to go through all the things there because we already saw it, but that same list of how the outer and the inner are very similar in all those ways. And chatat of havalei ribuye sheken haza'ah k'motah. But wouldn't you say the chatat of is in? Because haza'ah is the same, and that's the whole pasuk is all about haza'ah. But it's always quantity versus quality. Hanach nefishin. There's way more ways that the outer and the inner are similar, and therefore, even if we're going to start with the even if we're going to start with the inner one, we're going to learn from there to the outer one because they have a lot more similarities, and we're not going to, this is all assuming we have one inclusion that everybody agrees with. The one we're going to include is the inner now, is the outer sin offering, and the one we're going to exclude is the bird. Okay? And that's the conclusion. So just to review this section, it was all about why the inner sin offering and the outer sin offerings have kibus and the bird doesn't. And we started with assuming the main halacha is about the outer sin offering, the normal one, and we included the inner, excluded the outer, the bird. Why? Okay, so we had three answers, or really two, and then the third kind of flipped everything. So one was because it's just got more similarities in numbers. The second was the yochlena, specifically this is we're excluding specifically something that's eaten, so that would exclude the bird. And the third was we actually start from the pnimi, and then from there we get to the outer one, because they're more similar in more ways, and that's how we exclude the bird. And that all came from the word yazeh. Okay, now we're going to end our Gemara with three questions. By Rabbi Akiva. So the first two, and I mentioned this before, but now that we're getting to it, I'll mention it again. The first two have to do with these bird sin offerings and really not related to our topic, but we'll see that in the second question, they bring a source that we saw today from a braita, and to try to answer the question, in the end, these first two questions remain unanswered. By Rabbi Akiva, and then we'll get to a third question, which has to do with the blood on the garment, much more our topic. So Rabbi Akiva asked the question, back to this topic of bringing blood into the heichal. What if you bring the blood of the bird sin offering inside while it's still in the neck of the animal? Now, normally what happens, if you put the blood in a sanctified vessel and then you bring it into the sanctuary, it's disqualified. Okay? It's only disqualified once you put it in this sanctified vessel, because that's how it's become sanctified. Until then, it's not sanctified, so you haven't done anything. It's not really blood of a sin offering yet until it goes into that vessel. But if it's blood that's supposed to go outside, which means because it was already in the vessel, and then you brought it inside, it becomes disqualified. Now, a bird sin offering never goes in a vessel. So if it's in the neck, maybe the neck kind of serves as the klei sharet, that itself sanctifies, because it goes straight from the neck into onto the wall, sprayed onto the wall. So what's the story? Do we say, tzavara ki klei sharet ami umifsal? Its neck is like a klei sharet because it doesn't have any klei sharet it goes into, and therefore it's going to be disqualified if you brought it inside. O dilma kitzavar behema, or maybe it's like in the neck of an animal. Now, if I brought in an animal that I had slaughtered, and then I brought it the sin offering, and I brought it inside to the heichal while it was still in the neck of the animal, well, it says midama, from its blood. Amar Rachman of lo b'sara. It doesn't say it's meat. So if I bring the animal in, even though the blood's inside, that didn't disqualify it. So which one is the bird more similar to? We're going to try to have an answer, but we're not going to succeed. Tashma. Let's learn from here. Now, when it talks about a bird sin offering, and it says, what if I'm doing malika, and then pirkisa, so sometimes after you do it, right, it flails, v'nichnisa lifnim, and then it flails inside into the heichal, v'chazra, and then comes out, so the body kind of flails out, comes back in, kshera, it's fine. Now, why is it fine? We assume because it did it on its own. But it sounds like if I did it, if the Kohen brought it in while the blood was in its neck, psula, would be disqualified. Again, this is only after malika is done. Before malika, the fact there's blood and it doesn't matter. We're talking about blood that's about to come out and be sprinkled. So if you brought it in, it sounds like it would be disqualified. Okay, that's the inference. But now they're going to say that inference can't be because look at this other parallel source, and that can't be the inference in the parallel source, which means we're going to infer something else completely, which has nothing to do with the question. According to what you're saying, now when it comes to kodesh kodesh, they have to be slaughtered in the north. And if while you're slaughtering it, it flails and it goes into the south, it's not disqualified, right? And then it comes back into the north, it's fine. Hahotzia psula. It sounds like if you took it and physically put it in the south and then brought it back to the north, it would be disqualified. No, that's totally not true. So that would be the parallel inference, right? That if what it did while it flailed by itself isn't disqualified, but if you do it, it would. But that can't be. You don't disqualify an animal because while I was slaughtering it, I brought it for a minute into the south and put it back into the north. No. When does that kind of disqualification happen? When I put it outside the azara. So now they're going to say the inference is like this. Elahai yatzda lachutz it's tzricha. What it wants to tell you is not it flailed by itself versus if I did it. No, that's not the inference. The inference is if it flails by itself and it goes to the south, okay, which is not supposed to be there, it's supposed to be in the north and comes back, it's fine. But if it flails by itself and it flails outside the azara, it's disqualified. Okay, because that's outside the azara. Same thing with this other case. Hachanami. Likewise, we're going to say the same thing here. What it's saying is if the bird flails after the malika and flies into the heichal, it's not, and comes back, it's not disqualified. But if it flies outside the azara, it's disqualified. Okay? So that's what it's trying to tell you, and it doesn't infer anything for what if I brought it inside. Okay? So we can't get an answer. Second question, by Rabbi, so that really had nothing to do with anything, except that we were talking about bird sin offerings. But now by Rabbi Avin, he's going to ask a question again about bird sin offerings and connect it. So they kind of build, it's like a build-up. What if it spills on the floor and you collect the blood? Now, in a regular sacrifice, if you remember, if it spills straight from the neck of the animal onto the floor and never went into the klei sharet, it's disqualified. I can't pick it up. If it went in the klei sharet first and spilled on the floor, I can collect it. Because then it was already sanctified and then I can collect it off the floor. But if it goes straight there, it becomes immediately disqualified. Now, what about the bird? Now, the bird never goes into a sanctified vessel. So now, why doesn't it go into a sanctified vessel? We're going to have two ways to view this. Either, it just didn't require a klei sharet, and therefore, so when it requires a klei sharet and it doesn't go into a klei sharet, it's disqualified. If it doesn't require one, then if it falls on the floor, you could just pick it up and use it. Nothing happened to it. It didn't get disqualified by not going in one. It just doesn't need one. So therefore, you can pick it up in the floor and it's kasher. O Dilma, there's an interesting way of looking at it when it says it doesn't go into a klei sharet because mifsal pasel be'rachman a klei sharet. Maybe it disqualified it going into a klei sharet. Hilkach osfo upasul. Well, if it disqualifies it, what it means is why would it disqualify it going into a klei sharet? What's bad about a klei sharet? The point is it has to go straight from the neck of the animal straight to the altar. It can't go through any step in between, not to a klei sharet, and certainly not to the floor. Okay, it's going into a klei sharet will disqualify, for sure going on the floor will disqualify. So that's the question. Rava tries to learn this from our source that we had before. Amar Rava tashma yachol yehi dam chatat te'un kibus. Talmud lomar zot. Okay, what's the connection? Let's see. You might have thought the dam of the bird sin offering would need kibus. But it says zot. Now, what happens when the blood needs kibus? It means the blood flies onto your shirt and needs laundering. Now, when does blood need laundering? Only if it's blood that got on your shirt that could have been sprinkled on the altar. Now, let's think about it. If we go by option 2, they disqualified it going through any other stage first. Okay, now we're going to learn this halacha that when something comes into the airspace of a vessel, it's already going to be as if it's in the vessel. So, if the blood is coming toward my garment, as soon as it gets into the airspace of my garment, that's as if it went into a vessel or it fell on the floor or something like that, which means I can no longer use it for sprinkling on the altar. Now, if I can't use it for sprinkling on the altar, what do we learn in the Mishnah? As soon as the blood becomes disqualified, if it gets on my clothes, I don't have to launder it. So you would never even have a case. You don't need to exclude it because of the Torah. You should have just excluded it by saying it'll never be relevant, this halacha, to the bird sin offering, because as soon as it enters the airspace of my garment, before it touches the garment, it's already disqualified for sprinkling because it has to go straight from there onto the altar. So then it would be excluded for that reason. And it's not, which sounds like it's not disqualified by going on the floor. But they now say, you still need a pasuk to exclude it, because what if I had the bird, I was about to sprinkle it, and a garment got right up against it, and it went straight, without getting into airspace first, straight from the neck onto the garment, then you would think maybe it's disqualified. And that's why you need the pasuk zot to tell you not. Okay, so that's why we brought this whole sugya. We're going to end with this last question. Ba'amine Levi. The Girsa here says also, he asked Rabbi, okay, he asked Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Nitaz mi beged lebeged mahu. This is a completely different question. If it sprinkles on my garment and then from there drips onto another garment, there was a lot of blood, let's say, and it goes from one garment to the other. Does the second garment need kibus also? Do we say, mi beged kama idchele lekibus? Look, it already got on the first, once it gets on the first beged, maybe I can't sprinkle it anymore, which means it's disqualified. Once it's disqualified, if it goes from there onto some other garment, I don't need to launder it. O dil malo, or maybe not. So Amalei, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says to him, so Sheila, what kind of question is this? Obviously, ta'un kibus, mima nafshach. Either way you look at it, it needs kibus. But we're going to see that Rabbi holds by a particular position, and that's why he thinks this. I osfo v'kasher, if you were to be able, now here's the big question, and this is a debate. If I have a ton of blood that gets on my garment, and it starts dripping off my garment, can I use that to sprinkle the blood on the altar? So there's a debate. If I could collect the blood that's dripping out of this garment and use it on the altar, there's obviously no question. If I can use it on the altar, then obviously I need to launder. Those things always go hand in hand. So, again, he says, I osfo v'kasher, then ha-kasher. Obviously, it's kasher. Even if you say, though, the I osfo pasul, if I would collect it, I couldn't sprinkle it, the blood that would drip from there. But anak Rabbi Akiva sfirle, I told you we get to this at the end of the daf. I hold like a unique position, Rabbi Akiva, who disagrees with the position in the Mishnah. If at some point after it was in the klei sharet, it was worthy of being sprinkled, like this blood, it went from the klei sharet, sprinkled on the garment. At that point, before it sprinkled on the garment, I could use it. Now I can't use it anymore when it drips off the garment, but since at some point it was able to be used, damata kibus, you need to launder it. And that's why I would think, of course, you would launder it, because no matter what, you would launder it. It doesn't matter what you say about whether the blood coming out of the first garment can be used or can't be used for sprinkling. Either which way, it would need laundering. Okay, so quick review of our daf. We started with this question. How could Shmuel hold like Rabbi Shimon when he doesn't hold like Rabbi Shimon and melacha she'en tzricha legufa? To which we said, that's fine. He could hold like Rabbi Shimon and davar she'en mitkaven. He doesn't have to hold like him melacha she'en tzricha legufa. Then we had that halacha, which we also had a braita to strengthen it, and Shmuel, who wanted to gather 10 people to say it, about libations that get disqualified have to be burned in the temple floor. Then we started with this whole halacha of kibus, of laundering garments, and the main two things we did. First, we talked about why it also not just includes the one down on the outer altar, it also includes those down on the inner altar and excludes the bird offerings. And we explained why that is. We had 3 possible explanations and one that even switched the whole thing. Then we had 2 questions about bird sin offerings, which really didn't have to do with our topic, but the second one kind of brought us a source from our braita about this whole thing, about the bird offering not needing kibus to get to an answer, but both answers that we got to were rejected. Then Levi asked Rebbe a question, what if it goes from one garment to another? Would you have to launder the second garment? And Rebbe said, yes, you would, no matter how you look at it, and that's what we just ended with. With that, wishing everyone a happy Chanuka and a safe day, and hearts are with the families in Australia.